there was no specific event that precipitated the current crisis. So in that sense, it's different than 2008, when NATO extended the possibility of membership to Ukraine and Georgia very specifically in those agreements and public statements. And George W. Bush was pushing for Ukraine and Georgia to be added to NATO. That precipitated very directly the Russian move against Georgia, really. Uh, this, and then in 2014, there was a specific provocation, obviously, with a coup that overthrew and ousted Yanukovych and the takeover of anti-Russian forces in Ukraine in 2014. This is different. This has been a long simmering issue to the Russians. And if you look at the whole history of NATO expansion, even somebody like Yeltsin, who was so friendly to the United States, there was a release of new documents showing how upset even Yeltsin was back in 1994 about NATO expansion, even before it had actually begun during that time. And we know Gorbachev was, and we know Putin has been for 20 years. But Putin was never in a position of sufficient strength to do something about it. But that changed more recently. And a number of things have gone into the equation that have changed the situation. Number one, Russia, when the United States pulled out of the ABM treaty in 2002, Russia began its nuclear modernization. Other countries are modernizing now, but Russia was ahead of the rest of the world in modernizing. And so this begins back in the early 2000s and then culminates, you could say, with Putin's March 1st, 2018 State of the Nation address, when he announced his 5 new nuclear weapons, wonder weapons, all of which can circumvent U.S. missile defense. Number one. Number two, Russia had been modernizing its conventional forces. Back in 2008, even in 2014, Russia's capabilities were actually quite limited. But for the last 8 years, Putin has been doing everything he can to modernize Russia's military capabilities. Interestingly, there was an article in yesterday's New York Times talking about Russia's military capabilities and prowess and the success of its modernization across the board in terms of communications, in terms of modernizing the weapons, in terms of deployments. I mean, Russia is ahead of the game now in that regard. So this is very different than it was even a few years ago. So from a military standpoint, Russia can stand up to the US and NATO anywhere in Europe, and certainly in Ukraine or in the areas surrounding Russia. They made sure of that number. So that's one area. And I want to get back to that in a different context. Secondly, Russia's economy has strengthened. Russia's become much less dependent on foreign banks, on foreign investments, on even in foreign trade in a lot of ways. The sanctions that were imposed after 2014 have, if anything, done a couple effects. One is that Russia has now become more economically self-sufficient and independent and less dependent. Secondly, it's strengthened Russia's ties with China, also with India and Iran and others, but especially with China. So that's put Russia in a different geopolitical and a different economic situation, bolstered by the fact that energy prices have skyrocketed. The price of natural gas has gone up 400% in Europe in 1 year alone. So Russia has got a lot of currency and few debts compared to other countries. In terms of debts as a proportion of GDP, Russia is in a very, very strong position. So that puts it another way in a good position to act. Number three, Russia is in a strong position in terms of Europe and energy dependency. not only have the energy prices skyrocketed, but 41% of Europe's natural gas comes from Russia, and 25% of Europe's oil comes from Russia. So Russia has the Europeans by the short hairs right now, and it's in a position to actually, it's been able to divide Europe that way. So let's say that's number four, is that Europe is much more divided. And Trump contributed to that. Clearly, Trump's, America first, make America great again, stupidity policy, attacking America's allies with trade wars, with verbal assaults, with undependability in every regard, with not consulting them, has created a situation where Biden, when he came to power, what he kept saying is America's back again. We're now going to provide the leadership. We're going to unify Europe. Nobody trusts the United States at this point in any real sense, because they know that as quickly as Biden might try to do something to unify, then Trump could get back in there in 2024, or some other clown who's going to take the exact opposite position. So not only is this a factor in dealing with Iran or dealing with Russia or dealing with China, it's a factor in dealing with Europe as well. So there's divisions. And so that's why Macron keeps saying Europe needs an independent foreign policy separate from the United States. It's also why, despite everything that Blinken and Biden have been saying about unity between the US and Europe, no space between us, there's a lot of space between us, which is why Germany, especially, Baerbock, has been pretty hawkish, the Green Party foreign secretary, but foreign minister. But Scholz has been much less so, much less willing to commit to even cutting off Nord Stream 2. So Nord Stream 2 is finished, a lot of European financing, and ready to come online, except for some more paperwork. And it's going to drop costs, create more energy, direct flow from Russia, cut off, bypass Ukraine, which the Ukrainians are very unhappy about, and America's unhappy about. But the Europeans and Germany has not been willing to commit to cutting off Nord Stream 2 if Russia moves militarily. So that also puts Russia in a better position. And Germany, because of Germany's history, is very, very anti-war. And so they don't even want to see the kind of aid that the US, and especially Britain, when Britain sent lethal aid recently to Ukraine or to Estonia, they had to bypass German airspace. Germany has been refusing to give that kind of aid. So Germany, that's why this Ukrainian politician says, what is Germany going to give us next? Pillows? So Germany has been so that we don't have that kind of unity right now. So that also puts Russia in a good position. On top of that, we've got the fact that Russia has not only bolstered and modernized its forces, but it's been deploying them differently. So we saw what happened with Russia's intervention into Syria. It was much more successful, much more effective. Their air campaign, much more effective than anybody had anticipated. That's a very important development. On top of that, we've had other signs of Russia's military confidence right now. So Russia is in a strong position, and this is the right time for it to act, partly because of distractions. France has an election coming up in April. Other countries have elections coming up. The US has the midterms. On top of that, there's the perception that Russia and China have that the US is a declining superpower. That meeting in Anchorage between the two top Chinese foreign policymakers and Biden and Blinken and Sullivan in March of this year was very, very revealing and significant, because Blinken gets up with a 2-minute description of all the things that we don't like about China. And then the Chinese spokesperson gets up for 16 and a half minutes and harangues the US and says, you are no longer in a position morally, militarily, economically to talk to us from a position of strength. And he goes through the list of all the American transgressions in recent years. and says, you talk about a rules-based international order. What kind of bullshit is that? He says, what about the United Nations? What about international law that you've been breaking time and time again? And so we've got a situation now where Russia and China, especially, getting closer together, both see the U.S. in a position of decline, which was reinforced by the way the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. That made everybody think, wow, they really don't have their game together at all. And Biden, who comes in there claiming to be so competent, is actually quite incompetent. So you've got all of those factors at play that make this the right moment, plus the fact that the ground is freezing, that the tanks can get into Ukraine without any problem, that they've got 130 or so troops on the border, including the ones in Belarus for those war military exercises, that they've gone from 162 battalions, from 159 battalions to 100, or from 59 battalions to 162 battalions recently. And at the same time, NATO and the U.S. have been more provocative. They've been sending lethal aid. The U.S. did not, under Obama, agree to send lethal aid to Ukraine. It was Trump who started to do that in 2018. Then there was hope in 2019 when Zelensky came to power. And initially, he was a comedian in Russia, and he was speaking in Russian, and people were optimistic that maybe he would return to the Minsk II agreements and that we'd be able to find a diplomatic off-ramp. But by late 2019, he became much more anti-Russian. And then he was made clear that he doesn't want to return to the Minsk II agreements, wouldn't negotiate on that. He also got more and more NATO military aid, more and more NATO trainers, including at least a dozen NATO countries sending trainers there, including the U.S. He also got the Bayraktar drones from Turkey, which proved so effective in Azerbaijan defeating Armenia. So all of these things coming together, it looks increasingly to Russia that Ukraine is much more in the anti-Russia, pro-NATO camp. And that's a non-starter. Putin made that clear years ago, 14 years ago, and a lot of Americans got that, include the current U.S. CIA director, Burns, was then in 2008 the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And when they started talking about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO, Burns writes back a memo to Washington titled, "Niet means niet. Don't cross Russia's red lines. This is insanity." And so you've got Burns and you've got Sherman, who's a little bit more of a statesperson, and there's some space there between them, between the Hawks, the Victoria Nulands and the Blinkens and the Sullivans and the Campbells and some of the other people there. So if Russia is going to act, this is about the best, most propitious time for them to do so, from a lot of ways. So that's why this is happening now. That's a long-winded answer to your question, I think. Nobody seems to have any idea, and I don't have any idea either, if there's going to be a war. The indications after Russia received the written response to their demands and questions from NATO and Washington, Russia's response was fairly muted. And that's a good thing. You've got Lavrov and Peskov both saying that that they're disappointed, that this is no progress, that they're unoptimistic, but they want to keep talking. Putin is saying the same thing. They want to keep talking. So that's a good sign, because they did not get what they wanted in terms of their demands. They did not get any guarantee Ukraine won't join NATO. They don't get any guarantee that NATO won't expand to the east. They don't get any guarantee that NATO will not put munitions in the surrounding areas that can attack Russia. They didn't get any guarantee that NATO is going to pull back to the 1997 borders. So they didn't get their fundamental demands. But they did agree to keep talking. And they did say there was progress on some of the secondary issues like the missiles question, or the armed forces, or the transparency, or the arms control negotiations. Those are important, but they're secondary to Russia. I look for historical analogies, and there's a lot of bad analogies going around. And one of the bad analogies is the Munich analogy. And the Munich analogy is the West's belief that what happened with Munich, with Chamberlain in 38, was that because everybody wasn't standing up to Hitler, then they appeased Hitler and Hitler just kept on going. And they say that Putin is the same way. Well, it's a bad analogy, and there are a lot of people making it. You've got American leaders making the Munich analogy. Michael McCall, who's the ranking Republican member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, said that we all view this after Afghanistan as a moment of weakness. So we're not projecting strength, as Reagan talked about, but projecting weakness, which historically, go back to Hitler and Chamberlain, always invites aggression. I think you're going to see a lot more of it. You also have people like Marko Mihkelson, the chairman of the Estonian Foreign Affairs Committee, who says it smells like Munich, 1938. This whole idea. Well, that's a bad analogy. And the more that the U.S. does to build up Ukraine, to show how strong and tough we are, the more likely we are to provoking a Russian military action. Number one. Number two, Monroe Doctrine. Interesting op-ed last week in the New York Times by Peter Beinart, who talks about, and Beinart quotes Blinken. Blinken says, oh, well, the United States doesn't believe, I can give you that quote too. Blinken says, one country does not have the right to dictate the policies of another or tell that country with whom it may associate. One country does not have the right to exert a sphere of influence. That notion should be relegated to the dustbin of history. Well, maybe it should be, but it hasn't been. And Beinart argues there that the U.S. has had a sphere of influence in Central and South America since 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine. And he goes on there and he quotes Pompeo, and he quotes Tillerson, and he quotes Bolton. And they all say, just a couple of years ago, of course we've got a sphere of influence. And that applies to all of South America. And the U.S. has overthrown government after government after government in that area. It's not just the Cuban Missile Crisis, but so the sphere of influence argument is nonsense also. But the Cuban Missile Crisis is the more interesting one. In some ways, it was an existential crisis. In some ways, there were weapons put on America's border, and you saw how America responded. But the other thing about it that people lose sight of is that in 1962, during that crisis, Russia was in a terribly compromised and weakened position. The U.S. was ahead between 10 to 1 and 20 to 1 in the number of nuclear weapons, in the number of bombers that could strike the other side, in the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles. That advantage has been erased. However, there is an important lesson to be learned, and that is that negotiation, that crisis ended not with public diplomacy, like is going on here in the meetings of Geneva and Vienna and Brussels. That's not going to solve this, because the United States can't back down and say that there's not an open door for NATO and we're going to withdraw that. That crisis ended when Robert Kennedy, on October 27th, as the U.S. was about to invade the next day, met with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, and they came to a private understanding. And that this didn't come out for years and years and years, what they agreed on. But the United States gave Russia private assurances from the top that the U.S. would withdraw its nuclear missiles from Turkey within 5 months and would not invade Cuba in exchange for Russia withdrawing its missiles. That was the deal. We have to have the same kind of backroom negotiations today. We're not going to have a public negotiation. We can't do it. The U.S. cannot back down from NATO at this point the way Russia wants. The question is, will Russia accept American assurances, knowing that within 3 years there could be another president, within 1 year there could be another party controlling the House and the Senate, and not trusting America's goodwill? So, but that's the question. If they can, what we need is an agreement to Russian troops are going to maybe stay on the border for a little bit to save face, and then they're going to withdraw, but they're not going to invade. The U.S. is going to promise not to expand NATO any further and to begin cutting back on those more recent deployments of 5,000 more NATO troops to the Baltic countries and to Poland and Romania. Uh, and go beyond that. And we're going to have a summit. We're going to call for a summit, and I'd like to see a global summit with Russia, China, the U.S., Germany, and India. That's who I would choose right now. And we're going to begin to, the way we're going to diffuse this tension is by having positive commitment to work together as allies and not as adversaries and not as enemies. And we're going to deal together with nuclear weapons. We're going to deal together. So we're going to deal with moving toward dramatic reductions in nuclear weapons below the threshold for nuclear winter and no first use across the board. We're going to deal with the climate change, which is dramatically affecting Russia. That permafrost in Russia is melting. It's going to have enormous, terrible consequences long before that's going to create useful agriculture several decades from now. So we're going to deal with that. We're going to deal with the global health issue and the pandemic, which affects everybody. And we're going to deal with global development and the gap between rich and poor. And we're going to help Russia make that transition that they need to make from being a country dependent on oil and gas to a modern, thriving economy. So, can it be done? Yes. Is there another road out? The other road that is a little bit promising is there was a meeting a couple of days ago in Paris between the members of the Normandy group who had originally negotiated the Minsk II agreement. That's Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. And they had an 8-hour meeting, and they said it was positive. They didn't come to any agreement, but they hadn't met since December of 2019, so they didn't expect to come to an agreement. But the basis for that is that they'll have a ceasefire, they'll withdraw the forces. Russian forces will withdraw. They'll accept the border. They'll close the border between Ukraine and Russia, and they'll give autonomy to the Donbass area. That and I don't understand the intricacies of this, but experts who I've been reading say if that happens, then the Donbass will have veto power over Ukraine joining NATO. That will solve that immediate problem for the Russians. Russia has already given something like 600,000 passports to people in the Donbass. Those people identify with Russia much more than with Ukraine or Kiev. And so that's another way out of this crisis. So I see a lot of off ramps, but there's also a lot of very dangerous signs, increasing Russian troops on the border, increasing war games, increasing naval operations in the Black Sea, increasing aggression from NATO and from the U.S., sending more and more arms into Ukraine, and drawing more and more of a hard line. So there's no guarantee, but there are ways out of this. And if we have some statesmanship, it can be done.